Good evening. It's my pleasure to welcome you all for our program on Catholic Church, Society and Culture. My name is Piotr Bednarski. I'm a host of this program, and I've got great pleasure to welcome today Dr. Larry Chapp. Dr. Larry Chapp is a seasoned theologian, graduate of Fordham University, specialist in Hans Urs von Balthasar theology. He has been he taught theology for 20 years at DeSalle University. He authored a couple of books, and he is very productive in terms of articles, both serious theological articles published in renowned journals, but also more popular like National Catholic Register or Catholic World Report. And we are very privileged to have you today, Dr. Chapp, and I need to say also that I had pleasure to translate some of your articles into Polish, so Polish audience can have access. And welcome today for this program. We are very happy that you agreed to this meeting. Let me say a few words on organization of this meeting. This meeting is organized by EWTN Poland, Lay Catholic Association Przybądźcie Wierni, and Christian Center for Culture of Mary Our Queen from Poznań, and this is supported by Catholics from Poland and Switzerland. I will be running this interview with my colleague Zbigniew Przybyłowski, who is with us, and we will be supported also by Stefan Bartoszko of EWTN. Following our custom and good tradition, we would like to start our meeting asking Holy Spirit for his protection, for his light, and asking good God for peace in the world, for persecuted Christians, so he can they can get support and they get help of God, especially with this upcoming Divine Mercy feast. So let us pray. Pater noster, qui es in celis, sanctificetur nomen tuum, adveniat regnum tuum, fiat voluntas tua, sicut et terra et in celis. Panem nostrum da nobis hodie,
et dimita nobis debita
nostra, sicut et nos dimitibus debitoris nostris, et ne nos inducas in tentationem, sed libera nos
malo. Amen.
Amen. Zbigniew, the floor is yours.
Thank you. Good evening, Dr. Chapp.
Good evening.
Our custom is to first introduce the personality of our guests a little bit. So I would like to ask you to tell us a little bit about your life story. It is an interesting story, as far as I know. Could you please share your life journey to faith, to priesthood, and then study for priesthood, and then to your current position as a leading theologian?
Thank you. First off, thank you very much for having me. I really appreciate it. My life story, that's interesting. I grew up in the middle part of the United States, the American Midwest, in a state called Nebraska, which is a very agricultural state. Although I did not grow up on a farm, I grew up in the capital city of Lincoln, Nebraska, which is a university town. And I mention all that simply because I grew up I'm 64 years old, born in 1958. So I grew up in the 60s and 70s, essentially, in a very sort of typically Midwestern American way, very middle class, very suburban lifestyle. And our Catholicism in my family was worn lightly. My parents were Catholics and they got us catechized, but it didn't go very deep. We were essentially Americans first and sort of Catholics second, if that makes any sense. And so as I grew older into my teen years, I became disaffected from Catholicism. I thought nothing outrageous. I wasn't pumping my fist into the sky in a rage against God. It was just, I felt that it was boring, and I was more oriented towards the sciences. And so I got deeply into science and was interested in that and became a kind of atheist, agnostic, maybe. I just didn't take religion very seriously at all. But then I began to realize that my interest in science was essentially an interest in ultimate things. I was interested in reality. I was interested in what makes things go. Why are things the way they are? And that led me to realize that I had a kind of interest in philosophy. And that led me back into theology. And I started reading people like Cardinal Newman, C.S. Lewis. Of course, I'm American, so I was reading English, English speaking authors. And I sort of read my way back into the faith, although initially I simply became a kind of sort of Protestant evangelical kind of Christian, didn't take the institutional church very seriously. I still just sort of thought, as long as I have faith in Jesus, everything is fine. But then I started reading more deeply, and people like G.K. Chesterton and, as I said, Newman. And that led me to realize that Catholicism, the religion of my youth, was actually far more interesting than I thought it was. And I sort of reverted back to the Catholic faith. At that point, I decided, well, I think I should become a priest. That's how serious my reconversion was. So I went to seminary, undergraduate. I studied philosophy at a small seminary and learned all of the sort of Thomistic, neo-scholastic usual things that a Catholic seminarian learns in seminary. And it was in minor seminary, a college seminary, that I was introduced to thinkers like Henry de Lubac, Hans Urs von Balthasar, Joseph Ratzinger, some of the great lights, theological lights of the 20th century. And that made me really deeply interested in theology. I then went on for theological studies in a major seminary and went most of the way through, but realized at the end that my interest was not really in ministry, that I was not really called to be a priest, that my interest was intellectual and theological and not ordination. And so I quit the seminary and went off to Fordham University in New York City, Jesuit school, to get my PhD in theology, which I did. And I specialized, as Peter said, in the theology of Hans Urs von Balthasar. Immediately upon graduating from Fordham, I was very fortunate. It doesn't happen very often to sort of in the United States anymore. White, male, conservative Catholics, even in Catholic universities, tend not to get hired. But I was very fortunate. I got hired at a little place called DeSales University, which is in Pennsylvania, United States, and taught there for 20 years, mostly young people. I didn't teach graduate students. I taught undergraduates. And I consider myself very fortunate that I spent most of my teaching career teaching undergraduates, because it was a typical cross-section of modern DeSales is not a super Catholic place, and the student population is made up of a broad cross-section of people, and a very small minority were sort of serious devout Catholics. And that really honed my interest in evangelization, in spreading the faith in a modern world of unbelief. But over time, I had been teaching about this woman called Dorothy Day. Now, I don't know how many Polish people are aware of who she is. She is an American woman who, in the early 20th century, was a bit of a Marxist and an atheist and a political activist who converted to Catholicism and started this thing called the Catholic Worker Movement. And the Catholic Worker Movement is all about a super devotion to the poor. She was very Orthodox Catholic, very serious Catholic, but believed that the universal call to holiness was for all people, lay people included, and that we needed a more radical living out of the Sermon on the Mount. They also started Catholic worker farms to go with the soup kitchens and houses of hospitality, as they're called. And those farms were designed as sort of agrarian schools of, what her cohort, Peter Morn, called agronomic universities, in order to teach people certain lost skills, as well as to raise food for the poor. I was teaching about them at DeSales, and over time I began to feel called by God to leave the teaching profession, which had become very comfortable for me. I mean, the life of a professor is very comfortable. And I was reading all this stuff about living a radical Catholic faith, Dorothy Day, and serving the poor. And then I was, trotting off to Rome twice a year and eating at fine restaurants and living in a nice home and a cushy little professorial life. And I just didn't feel challenged enough. I didn't feel like it was radical enough. So my wife and I, my wife Carmina, who is also a doctor in theology, we decided let's just do it. So in my mid 50s, I gave up my tenure and my teaching position, and she and I bought and started a Catholic worker farm along with a former student of ours who is now a priest, Father John Gribowich. And that was 10 years ago, and we've been on the farm now for 10 years. And about 3 years ago, I really felt a need to get back into writing and some intellectual stimulation. And so I started my blog, Gaudium et Spes 22, and then started writing, for National Catholic Register, Catholic World Report, Our Sunday Visitor, a few other things. And now here I am all these years later. I have one daughter, and I've been married to my wife for 25 years, very, very happily so. And so that's who I am.
Very interesting. And so your farm is in the Midwest now, in Nebraska,
No.
or are you no?
It's in Pennsylvania, eastern Pennsylvania, near a town called Scranton, Pennsylvania.
Okay. Okay, and what do you produce on this farm, and what is your main sort of objective of conducting this activity?
Interestingly enough, the main objective is not farming as such. The main objective is for visitors to come to the farm and to engage in prayer. My wife and I are both Benedictine oblates, and we have a small chapel on our farm with the Eucharist reserved. We have permission to do that. And we lead people in Liturgy of the Hours, in the Divine Liturgy of the Hours. We have Mass there if they bring a priest. And we often then sit around afterwards and have extended conversations about the faith. And a lot of these people that come to the farm are not Catholic, but are somehow drawn to Catholicism and interested in it, and find the concept of what we're doing interesting. And so we believe that the main focus of prayer and these conversations have been extremely fruitful in bringing people to the faith. But then secondarily, we farm, and we raise a variety of vegetables that we then give away to various people. We don't charge money for anything. That's one of our charisms. We try to live voluntary poverty. And believe me, we're right just above the poverty level, and I don't wear that as a badge of honor or anything. It's just that's what it is. It's a very simple life, and so that's the other thing we try to image for people is it's possible to live a life without a lot of possessions. It's possible to live a life that's very simple and rooted in prayer, reading, contemplation, meditation, and then we raise these vegetables. But we also have animals on the farm. We raise pigs for food that we give away. But the main thing is we have sheep, and we shear the sheep, and my wife processes the fleece into wool, and she teaches people how to spin wool into yarn, and how to use that. We also have dairy goats, and so we teach people how to milk goats. We have egg-laying chickens. We have meat chickens we raise for meat. In the past, we've raised ducks for meat, and of course, we give it all away and share it freely. And a lot of it we give away to simply the visitors that come to the farm, but also we bring a lot to our church and disseminate it there. We did discover, here's one interesting thing, is that initially we started giving all of our food away to, like, what in the United States we call food pantries, which are usually things run by these local people that stock up on donated food and give it away to poor families, working poor mainly. But we discovered very quickly that a lot of these places don't need our food, because charity has become corporatized in the United States. So a lot of grocery stores and things like that give massive food donations to these food pantries. And so we really were shocked to find out that a lot of these venues didn't really want or need, I should say, our food. So that's why we started bringing it to our church and other churches, and allowing them to identify people of need that the food would be given away to.
That's fascinating. That's fascinating. So you kind of evangelize the visitors through prayer and work.
Yes. Ora et labora.
Ora et labora. So, so your charism, very interesting. So very happy to hear that. Let me take a step back. You studied at the Fordham University
Yes.
in New York, and that university has had a reputation of being a liberal place. Was it a liberal place at that time? And because
Yes.
such universities produce various sort of unorthodox thinkers, and in your case, of course, it didn't happen, judging by the life that you lead. But did you find it difficult to go through that university, through that education as an Orthodox Catholic?
In some ways, yes, some ways, no. It was a liberal place then, not as liberal as it has become now. It's far more liberal now than it was then. At that time, which was the early 1990s, the theology department there was dominated by the theology of Karl Rahner and a very liberal form of Rahnerianism, as it's called. And I was interested in Hans Urs von Balthasar and not Karl Rahner, and I sort of kicked against the dominant Rahnerian paradigm that was kind of being shoved down my throat, and that did provide some difficulty for me. I ran into some trouble with a few professors, but I have to say, over time, I kind of won them over when they began to realize that I wasn't a sort of fire breathing, reactionary. I wasn't a super right-wing Catholic, that I was just a Catholic, an Orthodox Catholic interested in Hans Urs von Balthasar. And that I, not to toot my own horn, but I was a fairly intelligent graduate student. And they appreciated, and these were Jesuits, all right? And so they appreciated, and hats off to them, they appreciated my intellect and the fact that I was a serious theology student. They did give me some trouble in writing a dissertation on Hans Urs von Balthasar, who at that time was considered to be the arch enemy of Karl Rahner's theology and to be too conservative or something or other, because, he opposed the ordination of women, he supported Humanae Vitae, and so that marked him as this arch conservative. So I did find resistance there. But a Jesuit came to my defense, a Jesuit by the name of Edward Oakes, who had written a book on Balthasar called Pattern of Redemption in English. And Father Oakes sort of ran interference for me and sort of paved the way for me. And he eventually became my dissertation director. And so I have to say, at the end, I graduated with distinction, and the Jesuits there, liked me, recommended me for jobs. And so I don't want to be too hard on them. Yeah, they were an intellectually challenging bunch in terms of my version of Catholicism. But overall, at the end of the day, they were very fair to me.
Okay, and in terms of how they treated the magisterium of the church and sort of the teaching on morality, did you at that time find that there were people who were kind of picking and choosing bits of the teaching that fitted them and then rejected other parts?
Yes, the main moral theologian at Fordham at that time was a Jesuit by the name of James Keenan. Keenan, James Keenan. And James Keenan was a big proponent of the moral theory that we now call proportionalism, which is a sort of Catholic version of situation ethics. I mean, that's a bit of a shorthand, a bit of a simplification, but that's what it is. And so, yeah, there was some, you don't like a church teaching, no, in moral theology, no big deal. Just plow your own field and go your own way. And so there was also an element there at Fordham in the moral theology department, but also outside of it, that viewed theology as a kind of second magisterium that stood alongside of the magisterium of the church and constituted its own authority. And so they felt justified in espousing dissenting forms of theology on the grounds that they too had a kind of magisterial authority, which of course I disagree with most profoundly, but that you're absolutely correct. That allowed them to sort of pick and choose amongst magisterial teachings to their liking.
Mm-hmm. And so, how would you explain the role and the mission of a theologian vis-a-vis the magisterium of the church. How do you view this apart from seeking for the truth yourself, right, for your
Yeah,
own background?
yeah. Well, it's the famous definition of theology by Saint Anselm is faith-seeking understanding. Uh, However, theology beyond that is a service to the church, and that's how I view my role as a theologian. It's a service to the church. It's an ecclesial vocation. It's not just an intellectual calling. It's an actual mission. It's a vocation oriented towards the good of the church, which means that the creedal elements of the church, the firm magisterial teachings of the church, have to form, for a Catholic theologian, they have to form your baseline. They have to form a bulwark beyond which you may not go. Otherwise, you're simply engaging in your being a religion of one or a magisterium of one. Now, that doesn't mean that the theologian simply has to repeat endlessly exactly what the magisterium teaches without any sort of innovation. I do think it's the role of a theologian to be a bit creative as well. What we would call, as the Catholic philosopher Gabriel Marcel called it, creative fidelity. You're faithful to the church's teaching, but also seek to deepen our understanding of that teaching to see if there aren't ways in which it can be developed in new directions in light of what we now know after 2,000 years, and such as the church always been. In light of current circumstances, new situations arise, new ideas arise, and not all of them bad, many of them are good, and theology has to see, well, the spoils of Egypt, what can we take with us even from non-believers, elements of the good that we can incorporate into our theology to see if we can deepen our insights into the doctrines of the church. So that's how I view theology: faithfulness to the magisterium of the church while attempting to aid the church by deepening her own understanding of what revelation means.
Okay, and then now we have a little bit of a difficulty with discipline among the priests who are theologians. But isn't there a bigger problem with lay theologians in order to sort of maintain the unity of the teaching of the church? I understand the exploration and the looking for new interpretation of the faith, but isn't there a bigger sort of risk or difficulty in lay people not being subjected to the authority of the bishops as a priest would be?
Yeah, there is, a layperson obviously doesn't have these vows of obedience and so forth that a priest would have. But I have to say, I don't know what it's like in Poland. Here in the United States, that vow of obedience doesn't seem to mean much when it comes to priest theologians. Priest theologians teaching in Catholic universities in the United States seem to just chart their own course regardless of what the bishops might say. In fact, they often come out and speak against the bishops. And in my experience, it's actually the lay theologians who tend to be more orthodox. So that's not to say there aren't lay theologians that aren't orthodox, because there are. But it just doesn't seem to me, with regard to the unorthodox lay theologians, they seem to take their cue about how to go about dissenting from church teaching from priest theologians that they see doing the same thing. So in many ways, my colleagues in the professorate here in the United States who are lay theologians, I think, tend to be much more concerned about church teaching than most of the priest theologians. Now, that would be in universities. In seminaries, it's most priest teaching in seminaries are just fine.
Okay. Let me ask you a question about Dorothy Day. You
Sure.
mentioned her as this very interesting personality who was working for the poor. Now, when we hear things like that from our Polish perspective, having had an experience of communism, these sort of ideas of working for the poor, breaking the system and things like that, those things sound very suspicious to us. A little bit like some of the streams in theology that tried to marry Marxism and Catholicism. Is there an element of that in the sort of teaching or the legacy of Dorothy Day, or was she really an Orthodox Catholic who just worked with the poor people?
She was just an Orthodox Catholic who worked with the poor. In fact, her main inspiration for working for other than the Sermon on the Mount and Christ himself, that we need to help the poor, came from the church's social teaching. Many of the social encyclicals of people like Pope Leo XIII, Rerum Novarum, and so forth, she often quoted from magisterial teaching on our need for charity and to serve the poor. She was a big proponent of the spiritual and corporal works of mercy. Now, yes, at one time in her life before her conversion, she flirted with atheism and Marxism, but she repudiated all of that. But she did retain, it's interesting, she did retain, even after her conversion, a deep distrust of capitalism, American-style corporate capitalism, and she did try to subvert that economic order. She didn't want to replace it with Marxism. In fact, she didn't have an economic theory of her own really at all, except for a theory called distributism. I don't know if in Poland, if people are aware of that, put forward by Catholics like Hilaire Belloc and G.K. Chesterton and so on, that simply is a kind of localist sort of. So her emphasis was on she was in opposition to centralization. She was in opposition to mass society, Gabriel Marcel's point as well, man against mass society. And so what she saw in the United States was capitalism converging with the ever-increasing power of the state to create this monolithic enterprise that wasn't rooted in a Christian vision of life, that was very soul-crushing. And so she championed what we would call these days a localist vision and the principle of subsidiarity. And so I would see her views not at all as Marxist, but more in tune with that localist and the principle of subsidiarity. And along these lines, I'll just say this, Pope John Paul II, of course, after the fall of communism in Poland, warned, right, that Poland risked becoming simply westernized in the way that, people in Western Europe and North America had been. And he warned them against some of the excesses of consumeristic capitalism and the kind of hedonism that goes with that. And so I would see Dorothy Day's vision sort of as part of that kind of a critique that, free markets are fine and all that sort of thing, but the kind of economics that we see today that is so oriented towards the simple generation of wealth devoid of moral concerns was a deep concern of hers.
Okay, I see. And then I guess when you have capitalistic monopolies emerging,
Yes.
these are some of the main drivers of centralization. So if the work for others is voluntary and not mandated by the state, by the powers, then I guess it is a Catholic and not a Marxist idea.
And remember too, when Dorothy Day first started her movement, which was around 1929 or 1930, the Great Depression was beginning. Also, there were no such things in the United States at that time as labor unions, and there were no labor laws. And so, it wasn't at all uncommon for the factory workers to work 12, 13-hour days, even little kids to be working these long hours and so forth. And so she was concerned about, the kind of economic conditions that laborers were in, but that doesn't mean she was, like a Marxist up with the proletariat kind of gal. She just was concerned about the fact that, as Pope Leo was in Rerum Novarum, concerned with the fact that labor was not being treated properly.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, let me ask you a different question. Your new website, the Gaudium et Spes, has a very peculiar name. And I wanted to sort of ask you about sort of what the main goal for this is. Having sort of prepared for this, I listened to some of your interviews, the ones that you gave to others, the ones that you conducted, and it seems to me that a little bit of that is a defense of Vaticanum Secundum, the Second Vatican Council.
Yes.
And I'm not a historian of the council. I'm not a theologian, so I don't know much about that. But let me ask you a question. Do you think, what is your overall assessment of the council? Was it a success or was it a failure? And, did it achieve the goals it set out to achieve? And what were the unplanned results? Were they worthy of the effort that was undertaken? And was the overall impact on the church positive or negative? And we are trying to square these ideas in our minds. We hear critics of the Vatican Council. We hear those who are saying that yes, everything's fine. What we do see is the situation of the church is not great. It's not going in a good direction.
Absolutely.
And we're looking for reasons for that. And we know that if two things coincide, there doesn't need to be causality there, but the correlation is striking. So that's a long question, but you understand my drift.
Oh, I do, and it's a question I get all the time, and it's an extremely complex question. First, the title of my blog, Gaudium et Spes 22. Obviously, Gaudium et Spes was the Latin title of a document of the Second Vatican Council, the last document promulgated, actually, the Church in the Modern World. In English, and 22 means section 22, which has a line in it that says essentially only in the light of Christ does the mystery of man make sense. In other words, it's sort of the first half of Gaudium et Spes lays out a Christologically centered theological anthropology, and Karol Wojtyła was sort of instrumental in that part of Gaudium et Spes. Now I think the second half of Gaudium et Spes is less good, but the first half I think is very good. Anyway. To answer your question, then, I think the council was both a success and a failure, and it's a complex. First off, in my blog, I'm not so interested in defending the council as such. Councils do sometimes fail, and so if this one is a failure, I have no problem. It's okay, it failed, no big deal. In some ways it is, some ways it isn't. My main interest is actually in defending the theology that animated the council, the theology that produced the council. And that theology was essentially the theology that John Paul II and Joseph Ratzinger, the two popes, also were champions of. And it's a theology called ressourcement theology. It's a French word, the return to the sources. And it was a theology designed to, in a sense, build off of Thomism, build off of neo-scholasticism by incorporating more scripture and more of the church fathers to broaden our understanding of the tradition. And so that's how they returned to the sources. And there were many famous theologians, the most famous ones really of the 20th century, Romano Guardini, Henry de Lubac, Jean Danielou, Joseph Ratzinger, Karol Wojtyła, people like this, that were big champions of this theology. That's the theology that produced the council, and with some qualifications. And so in that sense, ressourcement theology sort of won the day at the council. In that sense, I think the council was a success because I believe that theology really is the best theology that the church has right now. And my blog is primarily devoted, and my writing efforts are primarily devoted to positioning that kind of communio theology, ressourcement theology, the legacy of Benedict and John Paul, as the antidote to our current malaise in the church, which sees this striking polarity between Catholic liberals, progressives on the one hand, and an increasing number, at least here in the United States, of hyper-traditionalist Catholics who simply want to roll the clock back and go back to what things were like before the council, the Latin Mass, and so on. And those two are sort of tidally locked into debate with one another. Excuse me. And this ressourcement theology that John Paul represented, I think, is in danger of being eclipsed. I think it's in danger of being forgotten in the midst of this debate. And I'm a huge fan of John Paul's, a big champion of his. And so I really was interested in my blog defending that legacy and the theology that underpinned it. Now, I think if you look at what happened after the council, of course, it's a failure. Probably the worst apostasy in the history of the church that we have seen over the past 60 years, the worst falling away, the worst kinds of liturgical abuses, the worst kind of theological heresy and dissent permeating the church, loss of vocations, priests and nuns leaving their orders, massive ignorance on the part of most Catholics of the faith, and losing the youth in droves from the faith. However, my claim would be that this has been, that I think some version of that collapse of Catholicism would have happened regardless of whether or not there had been a Vatican Council. And I think the council acted as a kind of accelerant, a kind of catalyst that sort of lit a fire under those forces by simply opening the doors to conversation more. But I think it is a collapse that would have happened anyway, because it was a collapse that was, believe it or not, already starting before the council. The idea that the church before the council was healthy, and then the council came, and then the church after the council was unhealthy, is a deeply flawed analysis, because something has to explain why, in a sense, the culture of the church collapsed almost overnight. How did it collapse almost overnight if the faith was so robust before the council? Joseph Ratzinger in 1958 wrote a famous article as a young priest, newly minted PhD. It was called "The New Heathenism in the Church." And it hit like a bombshell in Germany when he wrote it. And what he was pointing out was something that many Catholic authors had been pointing out, even deeply traditional ones like a Garrigou-Lagrange and so forth, were pointing out the church is sick. You can go back to literary figures like George Bernanos, or philosophical figures like Etienne Gilson and Jacques Maritain, who were also pointing out similar things to what Ratzinger was saying, that there is already this deep inner rot, spiritual rot within the church. Ratzinger says, yes, the outward metrics of the church in 1958, the outward metrics of the church, the statistics of mass attendance and vocations, that all looks good. But he actually says in the article, this only proves that statistics can lie, because we all know that underneath that sort of edifice, there is a deep, deep, deep crisis of faith brewing in the church, and there's going to be a day of reckoning, and it's going to come soon. And if you look at other Christian denominations, you see this same decline and collapse that happened in Catholicism happened to them as well. I mean, for example, the Eastern Orthodox churches that exist in the United States, they have a beautiful liturgy still. They didn't have a Vatican II. They're bleeding and hemorrhaging people left and right these days, just like the Catholic Church is. And of course, the Protestant churches all went through serious, serious decline. The fact of the matter is, Western culture is deeply corrosive to traditional forms of religion. We find the Muslim immigrants in the United States are becoming more and more secularized. I used to teach a lot of Hindu students when I taught in a prep school in earlier days. And one of the things that I would talk to the Hindu parents, and the reason why they would send their kids to a Catholic school was because they were deeply concerned that their kids were becoming pagans. Their kids were, that there weren't any Hindu schools, so off to the Catholic school, because at least they get spiritual values. And so Western culture is just corrosive. And it's not just Catholicism that's declined. Every religion across the board has declined, really, in the West. And something has to account for that, and it's secularization. So we can blame the council for that, but I think that's a very superficial thing to do. And I think the council still has deep theological resources that we can tap into to aid and abet our efforts to move forward.
Okay, if I may, just two more quick questions. One is, does it need corrections in certain points, the theology, and if so, in what points? And the second thing is, would you have a diagnosis of what happened and when it happened, that sort of this collapse was actually materializing after the door was open, as you say? Was it the 19th century German philosophy? Was it the abundance of the Western sort of welfare societies? Because we saw here in Poland that as long as we were oppressed and poor, there were a lot of believing people. And then when we opened the doors to the West, you know, the warnings of John Paul II, Saint John Paul II, all came true.
Yes. It's you know, you can look at it from a variety of perspectives. I mean, you can go back to the 1830s, and you can already find Cardinal Newman, who wasn't Cardinal Newman then, he was still an Anglican, in England, warning, you know, that the church was becoming accommodated to modern secular society, and warning that the kind of political liberalism and the forms of democracy and consumerism that were arising in the West were going to be deeply corrosive to revealed religion. And so we can point that out, but those are the deep cultural factors that eventually were brewing for many decades, if not, you know, a couple of centuries. And there, you mentioned German philosophy, yep, and then there's, you know, just the generation of wealth and the rise of the middle class and universal literacy, and just, you know, the invention of radio and TV and, you know, cars and things. So society just changes radically, and this is going to have an effect. But the more proximate collapse that we're all concerned with, where there were absolute outward signs that the bottom has fallen out of the church, happened almost immediately after the council. I mean, you already saw it sort of beginning even during the council, but after the council, 1965, 1966, you already see the wheels coming off the car. And I really think it was a newfound sense of freedom that theologians and priests felt. In this sense, one of the problems that we have had in the modern church, and I, believe it or not, even though I've said I'm a huge fan of John Paul's, and I am, but we have not had a pope, and I would include John Paul in this, who has governed the church properly since before the council. And I think this is one of the problems, that immediately after the council, St. Paul VI failed, in a sense, to guide the church in a disciplined way towards the implementation of the council. And he allowed the council, without any disciplinary action on his part, to simply drift in these progressive and liberal directions. And so everybody simply had this sense of, hooray, now we get to think and do whatever we want because the Pope isn't going to do anything. John Paul tried to put the brakes on a little bit, as did Pope Benedict. But overall, I mean, John Paul's concerns were geopolitical, and they were theological, and they were much more prophetic. I don't think he was all that interested in being a disciplinarian pope and governing the church with an iron fist and so on. I'm not certain iron-fisted approaches would have worked, but some more sort of, for example, Pope John Paul published Ex Corde Ecclesiae, which was his document on Catholic higher education and how to reform it. And he had all kinds of beautiful things to say in there about what a Catholic university should look like. And yet it was simply routinely ignored. And there were no consequences to that being ignored. So I really think that what we saw was liberalism, Catholic liberalism, running crazy after the council, because they felt like there were no impediments for them to do so. That the church of syllabus of errors and the forbidden index of books and silencing of theologians, that church was gone. And now theologians had free reign to do whatever the heck they wanted. Now, I don't want a church of the syllabus of errors and all that to come back either, because all that did was suppress dissent, send it underground instead of dealing with it in a forthright way. And Pope Benedict made the same point. He said, the oath against modernism, Pius X syllabus of errors, all that sort of thing, it sort of bought the church time. But Pope Benedict said it didn't really deal with the nub of the problem, which was the crisis of modernism in the church and in her theological guild. And so what we needed, I think, were popes after the council to throw their weight completely and totally behind the sort of faithful theologians that were out there toiling away against this tsunami of theological dissent that was happening. Now, I think in defense of these popes, John Paul included, I think that they just felt overwhelmed. Pope Paul VI spoke of the smoke of Satan entering the church. And I think this is what he meant by that. He felt like, what am I to do? There seems to be this demonic element that has infiltrated the church and taken over to such an extent that there's very, very little a pope in Rome can really do about it. So it's a real crisis, and it's a real question.
That was extremely interesting, Larry. I've got a number of associations with what you said. I would add 2 or 3 elements. I think publishing Catechism of Catholic Church was a big step forward, because it was
Yes.
a sort of disciplinary measure, but in a very good sense. Also, the Congregation for Doctrine and Faith, the role of Cardinal Ratzinger, he was disciplining in very, very cultural, very, very civilized and very gentle way, unorthodox theologians. Charles Curran comes to my mind. Sister Gremick comes to my mind. He did the best he could and actually, I went to Catholic University of America just a few years after Curran lost his position, and he sued the university, and eventually he lost the lawsuit. This was a kind of breakthrough, I think, and there were some good actions, but I would agree that perhaps it was not enough. It was in many places church was in disarray. I mean, what comes to my mind is Oleic declaration of theologians after the Humane Vitae and the whole Dissent and Notre Dame and Jesuit universities. This was so, I would say, destructive for the church, and I could see certain elements at Catholic University when I was there, because people still remember. So my question at this, sharing this reflection, my question is, what are the key challenges now in terms of the moral theology, and as lay Catholics, what we should be sensitive, or what shall we do to protect our children, to help them go through this new stream of cultural revolution, because we see many trends, starting with gender ideology, LGBT kind of hype, and ending up with a completely new phenomenon, which are more related to biotechnology and transhumanism. These new trends promoted by World Economic Forum and some elites in US, Gates and Zuckerberg and big guys from this giant software houses. This opens completely new dimension. What's your reading of the situation, and what's your lesson for parents, for lay Catholics?
Okay. Before I answer that, I do want to go back to John Paul for 1 second, because I agree with you that the publication of the Catechism was huge, and some of the things that Ratzinger did at the CDF were extremely important. But in the defense of John Paul, we have a saying in the United States that it does no good to close the barn door once the horses have escaped. And the problem is, John Paul got elected in 1978, and the horses had already escaped. And so I think at that point, he made the adjudication, he made the decision that what his role would be as Pope is to make sure that the center held, that Rome held firm, that doctrine held firm. And to that extent, he wanted to put out the Catechism, and he instructed Ratzinger to discipline the worst sort of offenders. But the problem was so massive that simply disciplining a few here and there wasn't going to do much good. So I think John Paul thought, I'm going to do an end run around all of these people. I'm going to go directly to the people. I'm going to go travel all over the world. I'm going to go to young people, and I'm going to energize them with an orthodox vision of Catholicism, so that the new generation of Catholics coming up, what we call in the United States the John Paul II generation of Catholics, will replace the old liberal Catholics and their issues. So anyway, I think that was his thing. And I think to some extent he was very successful at that. Unfortunately, I think it's being undone in the current pontificate, but I don't necessarily want to go that way. But the challenges that we face today, culturally speaking, you mentioned LGBTQ in the United States right now. The transgenderism stuff is just off the charts insane. It is just, we have descended as a culture into a depth of unreality and insanity that is just unbelievable. That a man can get pregnant and a woman can have male genitalia, and and what the heck does this even mean? And this is coming into our schools. It's infiltrating. You find Catholic priests in the United States who are big champions of this stuff too, which is insane. And so you've got these right now. You have in the United States, and I assume perhaps in Poland as well, those Catholics that were energized by the pontificates of John Paul and Benedict feel very, very demoralized right now. And there is still a strong subculture of very faithful and Orthodox Catholics here in the United States. And they do sort of band together and form little groups and so on, but they feel besieged right now. And they don't feel like they're getting all the support from the hierarchy that they need. At least here in the United States, I think they're partly true about that. Not completely, but partly true about that. And so what we can do, those of us who are involved in, getting the word out, evangelizing, blogging, writing, teaching, these sorts of things, I think it's extremely important that we provide for interested lay people the tools that they need to educate themselves deeply about what the Catholic faith is and what it's not just in terms of catechism, but what its deeper implications are. Okay, so that they can understand intellectually why the church teaches what it is that it teaches. And that means introducing lay people to some of the great works that are out there that they can read. Now, erudite scholarly theology and philosophy and these sorts are beyond the average lay person. But there are things that we can provide to lay people. And my point would be this too. At this point, the lay people that you're referencing, what are we, how are we to rise to this crisis? What can we do for these concerned Catholics? How do we equip them with what they need to do to fight this tsunami? I think that it's important for these lay people themselves to take hold of their own destiny, to educate themselves. There are, in this age of the internet, there are so many resources out there for the average Catholic to educate themselves more deeply about what it is that the faith teaches. So I always tell people when they come to my farm, because they ask me the same, what can we do? What can we do? Read, and then read some more. And then when you're done reading that, read some more and educate yourself and watch videos on various things on the internet from erudite and faithful priests and other theologians who are helping people understand the faith better. There is just this, it's not a crisis of education. So there's a deep crisis of intellectuality, I think, amongst Catholic lay people who have not delved as deeply as they should into the intellectual resources of the church and the intellectual sort of tradition of the church. And I don't think, I know that sounds impossible, but I don't think there's any substitute for that. No strategy is going to work. No reorganizing of parishes is going to work. The average lay Catholic person has simply got to educate themselves, or otherwise they're not going to stand against this tide.
Mm-hmm. Very interesting, and I think this brings to the table the question that 70% of the Catholics in US do not believe in real presence. And I saw this initiative that your US episcopate to revive the Eucharistic adoration, Eucharistic understanding. I think this is also coming to other countries. I mean, especially young generation, they don't sometimes understand basic truth of Catholicism. On the other hand, I think in one of your interviews, you pointed very rightly to it's not only intellectual formation, it's also formation of the heart and style of living. And you mentioned this kind of simplicity and modesty. I mean, we cannot attract, I work with people who have on average 32 years. The corporation is flooded with young people. they are not attracted at certain level to immediately to intellectual debate. They want to see certain attitudes, certain approach to life. Sometimes it comes from very strange angles. A friend of mine who was an excellent professor of moral theology, he said he was promoting ecology of a man. Ecology is very kind of fashionable word here, right? But sometimes considered in a very convoluted way. But ecology of man is respecting the dignity of human person in all aspects, not only moral, but also good food, hard work, modesty, saving environment, yes, and things like that. Could you comment on this holistic approach to attract young people, especially our kids or their friends who are departing from the church?
Yeah, I often say we need to make Christianity weird again, in the sense that I don't think young people are walking away from the church simply because they disagree with this or that issue. I think they're walking away from the church, I think, because they find it stale and boring, and it just doesn't speak to them on any deep or profound level. And so in many ways, we have to realize that we have to begin again, and we have to try and re-weird Christianity, make it not, not bad weird as in strange and bizarre, but weird in the sense of not shying away at all from the most robust elements of our liturgical and spiritual and holiness traditions, and simply lay them out there in a radical way for young people to ingest. And I think that when that happens, and it does happen here and there, you find that young people flock to the faith. They return to the faith. They're drawn to the faith when it becomes something a little more cutting edge, a little edgy, a little in your face, a little provocative, a little avant-garde even. And I think this is a deep requirement to sort of make Christianity interesting again. And I think this is profoundly important. And lay people need to seek out each other in parishes to form little Bible study groups, prayer groups, and our parish does that. And one thing I neglected as well in terms of what parents can do, to the extent that they can. I don't know what it's like in Poland, but here in the United States, the homeschooling movement is exploding. It's really growing. My wife actually is the leader of our homeschooling cooperative in our local Catholic parish. Has what's called a homeschooling cooperative, where parents bring their kids to the church, and all these parents with degrees and so forth volunteer to teach these kids. And I think that it's very important that we get our kids out of the government schools, which have simply become corrosive to the faith and insane. And to a great extent, the Catholic schools are in some cases good, but often just kind of bland and anodyne, and not really presenting the faith in a way that's attractive to kids. And so I think homeschooling is another thing that parents can do. Now, that usually requires one stay-at-home parent, which is something that not every parent can do. But anyway, I agree with you. I think it's important that we find ways, especially to attract and bring back the young to the church. And I just you mentioned 70% of Catholics in the United States don't believe in the real presence. So yeah, 30% do, and I think that 30% represents actually the number of actually sincere Catholics. I think that other stuff, I don't want to be judgmental. I don't know why that other, the 70%, seem to be such lukewarm Catholics. Why even bother coming to church anymore if you're such lukewarm Catholics? I guess they have a variety of reasons, but I would surmise that only about 30% of church-going Catholics, the ones that do believe in the real presence, are the serious Catholics. And those are the ones that we have to, I think, energize. Those are the ones we have to keep from becoming overly demoralized, because they will rise up the overall tone of the parish along with it. In some ways, I mean, the crisis of the real presence isn't just a crisis of bad catechesis, because even when they're taught the proper catechesis, it just goes over their head and they say, well, I don't get that I don't believe that. The problem is, as Pope Francis actually mentioned in Desiderio Desideravi, that the problem is a deep crisis of believing in sacraments in general in the church. We live in a society that doesn't value the realm of the symbolic very much, especially the sacramental and iconic elements of the symbolic, the sacred elements of the symbolic. And so the fact that so many Catholics, even when told the proper doctrine, don't believe in the real presence means, I think, that what it is that they don't understand the nature of a sacrament, and that they don't really have a deep appreciation for what it is that the sacraments do in general, because they tend to be Gnostics. Only the spirit matters. All that material stuff is just so much fluff.
Yeah, that's fascinating. Your observation on the current trend in society. What is not helpful, to tell you the truth, from our position as lay people, certain prelates of the Catholic Church, like Cardinal Hollerich, Cardinal Marx, German bishops, some American bishops like Cardinal McElroy and Cupich, pronouncing teaching which apparently is a breaking from magisterium. This is how we read. Perhaps we simplify this perception, and doesn't help, because this brings more confusion. And if in your article you suggest that perhaps in approach to moral theology, Pope Francis in a way endorsed Bernhard Haring, and he greets Sister Gramick, pronouncing, let's say, immoral message for the LGBT people. How we can find ourselves in such environment when the hierarchy is not our ally, but it makes our life even more difficult. And your articles, for example, about dissent from the papal teaching by Pontifical Academy of Life brings to light also the very annoying trends in the institutions which should defend the family and marriage. Your comment on that, how we should read it?
Yeah, I think you could also add to that list the promotion to a Vatican job of Father James Martin, an American Jesuit, who's very big on the LGBTQ stuff, as well as the essentially the demolition of the John Paul II Institute for Studies on Marriage and the Family in Rome, and replacing all of the old professors with professors that actually would contradict what John Paul teaches. Look, I'm going to be blunt here. Okay, I hope that's okay. I'm not a fan of Pope Francis. I think that Pope Francis has demoralized the deeply devout and sincere Catholic element in the church, the Orthodox John Paul II element in the church. I think that despite his outward words to the contrary, I think that one of his goals is the slow but steady, brick by brick demolition of the theological legacy of John Paul II, especially in matters of moral theology, especially Veritatis Splendor, the Pope's wonderful encyclical on moral theology. One or two Cardinal Hollerich and so forth could be just set aside as an exception, but after a while it becomes a trend. As all those examples you pointed out point to the fact that this is the favored methodology in moral theology of Pope Francis. It just seems very clear that this is the methodology that he's trying to promote. So it's extremely difficult now, a crisis, because the crisis that we face is now no longer just a crisis of culture. All right, so that we have to bring the message of a John Paul or a Pope Benedict to the world in a culture that is corrosive and unbelieving. Now we have to fight elements within the church herself, from the top down, where, just devout, faithful Catholics, so all they want to do is attend the old-fashioned Latin Mass, are slapped aside and repressed and told that that's very bad. You can't do that anymore. All the while, priests and nuns can run around promoting gay sex, and that's apparently okay, under the name of a kind of proportionalist moral theology that says, we have to take their complex circumstances into account, and so on. This is hogwash. I mean, that's an Americanism, hogwash, nonsense. All right. It's here in the United States, especially Cardinal McElroy of late, who was given the Cardinal's red hat by Pope John Paul, which appalled most devout American Catholics, because we knew
by Francis. You said
Yes,
John
by
Paul.
Pope Francis. Oh, I said John Paul, by Pope Francis. I'm sorry.
Oh,
Yeah, and we were appalled at that because we knew what McElroy stood for. And I cannot help but think that Pope Francis knows what McElroy stands for. And now McElroy is on a speaking tour in the United States promoting all of this proportionalist moral theology, and he's not slapped down by the Pope. In fact, he's encouraged. And so this constitutes a grave crisis of authority in the church. And this is what I meant when I said that the average sort of devout Catholic feels very besieged and demoralized right now. It used to be the case that at least we believed that Rome had our backs. At least when John Paul and Benedict were the Pope, we could point to Rome and say, the center is holding. There is orthodoxy, and the Pope has our back. We no longer feel that way. Now we feel like Rome is actually part of the problem. And that's a very awful situation for a Catholic to find themselves in, to find themselves in a sense of alienation from the papacy, from the Bishop of Rome. We're supposed to love the Holy Father and respect him and pray for him and so on. And yet the Holy Father doesn't seem to reciprocate with gestures of where's all this talk of dialogue and accompaniment and going to the margins when it comes to devout conservative traditional Catholics. Apparently discernment and accompaniment only pertain to people on the far left. It only pertains to sexual sinners, apparently. It doesn't pertain to devout Catholics who feel besieged by the culture. The Pope's throwing them under the bus. Good luck with all that. For example, if I know people, for example, that teach religion in Catholic schools, and the majority of teachers in those Catholic schools are all modern, secularized people who believe in the LGBTQ agenda and so on. And yet these religion teachers are trying to teach the Orthodox faith, and they feel besieged. But once again, at least when John Paul and Benedict were popes, they could say, well, the Pope agrees with me. The Pope is on my side. So you guys are the odd man out, and I don't care how many of you there are. But now this religion teacher has to face even like the priest principal of the school or faculty members of the school and say, hey, look, the Pope agrees with us now. The Pope is on our side now. He's not on your side. So you're going against the teaching of the church now. Now, they're kind of wrong about that because, Pope Francis hasn't changed any particular moral teaching of the church, but he has certainly green-lighted a wink and a nod at the dissenting. And that has emboldened people and made life very difficult for devout Catholics who work in Catholic institutions who now feel besieged, not just by the culture, but by the church herself.
We really sympathize with your observation, and we could prolong this theme for quite a while. But I need to touch also some other very important themes. That one of the themes I would like to address is this infinite improbability that human freedom will be able to ultimately resist God. So this is Hans Urs von Balthasar approach to the salvation for all, etc. I sent you some links, and
Yes.
There was a debate how to interpret that. Could you elaborate your views? Because we are open to discussion. We want to understand. I need to say that he is very prominent theologian, Hans Urs von Balthasar. My wife, for example, read Roman Resentment, very thick and good book by Balthasar, and she was so much impressed. So we are not biased, but we would like to understand whether he was for apostasis or not, because this infinite improbable possibility that the people would resist, it sounds like that he's sure that the hell will be empty. Could you clarify on that?
Yeah, first off, I want to begin by saying that the book in question that Balthasar wrote that is so contested, translated in English, it's called Dare We Hope That All Men Be Saved. But the German title is actually less provocative. The German title is Was dürfen wir hoffen, which means what are we allowed to hope for? What may we hope for? And so he's trying to articulate a vision of heaven and hell that stays within the parameters of church teaching. He's not trying to be heretical here. And he's saying, okay, what does the church allow us to hope for? What does Revelation allow us to hope for? And in that book, he quite explicitly condemns apokatastasis. He condemns the notion that we can just simply now all become universalists. The universal salvation should just now be what we believe. He condemns that notion. His point is simply in that book that if you look at the New Testament, juxtaposed in the New Testament without any overarching synthesis, excuse me, are verses that imply that there's going to be a lot of people in hell. Many there are that are on the path to perdition, and few there are that are on the, towards the narrow gate, and all that. And Jesus talks a lot about hell and weeping and gnashing of teeth. And and Balthasar mentions all these. And he says we have to take the possibility of hell very, very, very seriously, and judgment very seriously, because it's embedded in the New Testament. But then he points to, though, other aspects of the New Testament that point in the direction that maybe, just maybe, in the end, we can hope that God will save everyone. We can hope that. And he also quotes in the book the fact that there are places in the church's liturgy where she asks us to pray for the salvation of all. Paul in Timothy says that God wills the salvation of all. Okay, so it is God's will that all should be saved. And therefore, Balthasar says, well, can we not at least hope for what it is that God's will be done on earth as it is in heaven? Can we not hope that maybe, just maybe, God will find some way to eventually save everyone? Now, this doesn't mean that Balthasar teaches some notion of the irresistibility of grace. That would be the position of an American Eastern Orthodox theologian named David Bentley Hart, who is a universalist, and he's the most famous champion of universalism in the United States right now, the most prominent. And I like David. I'm friends with David, and I have a certain sympathy with his theology. But nevertheless, he just point blank says that there's no way that a soul can ultimately resist God's overtures of love and grace. And he cites Aquinas here. Aquinas says our wills are naturally oriented towards the good. Even when we choose evil, we choose it under some aspect of the good. It's just that we're usually choosing a lesser good over a higher good, and so on when we sin. And so Hart says that's a basic Thomistic fact of anthropology, that we're oriented towards the good. So when we encounter the infinite good that is God, how could we ultimately resist it? Now, there's a lot of problems with that. And Balthasar doesn't agree with that. Balthasar holds out the possibility that damnation might just happen for some. But it should be pointed out, too, Pope Benedict in his encyclical Spe Salvi, I forget which paragraph, towards the middle of the encyclical, Pope Benedict says that actually, and he just flat out says, probably most people are going to go to heaven, and only the most horrible people are going to go. I'm paraphrasing. That's not exactly what he says. But in essence, Benedict says hell is reserved for those really awful sinners who will resist God's grace to the bitter end, whereas most people will not. And so it's not quite the Balthasarian view, but close to it. But I will also point out that Balthasar wrote that book, Was dürfen wir hoffen, fairly late in his career. And it's not the main point of his theology. And unfortunately, it's the single point that traditionalists in particular, like Ralph Martin, like to point to and say, this is why we have to be very suspicious of Hans Urs von Balthasar. Hey, if Balthasar is wrong on this point, then he's wrong. But Balthasar always submitted himself to the magisterium of the church. He was a very orthodox and faithful theologian. And if Rome had ever come out and said to him, that's wrong, you need to retract that, he would have. He would have. So, if Balthasar is wrong on this point, he's wrong. And I have no dog in that fight, and I so on. Because my love for Balthasar's theology does not revolve around this particular book of his. It revolves more around his Trinitarian theology, his Christology, his ecclesiology, sacramentology, and so on. And so I think it's very important that we understand that this is not a central point in Balthasar's theology at all. But anyway, I could say more, but
that's absolutely clear. That's absolutely clear what you're saying. I need to also to mention that Ralph is a charismatic renewal leader, so he cannot be absolutely associated with traditionalist view. He's just a defender of Ralph Martin.
He's not a traditionalist. Yeah, Ralph Martin is not a traditionalist.
Yeah, no. He wants to be really fair to both sides. One thing which he pointed out, which really made me think, is this relation with Adrian von Speyer. Hans Urs von Balthasar, why he left the Jesuits, why he stayed with her husband and herself for so many years. This is not for me that clear, but probably it's a subject for separate discussion. I would be very.
I think Ralph Martin is very unfair to the point of uncharity to Balthasar on the point of Adrian von Speyer. In his latest book, Crisis in the Church, he has a whole chapter that's the title of the chapter is Satanic Delusions. And in that chapter, he lists all kinds of modern horrible people, Nazis, the Holocaust, abortionists, transgender. I mean, he goes on and on and on with this litany of horrible evils in the modern world that he believes are the result of demonic influences. But he leads the chapter off with a discussion of Balthasar and his relationship to von Speyer. So in many, many ways, he's saying that this relationship that Balthasar and von Speyer had is demonic. It's under satanic influence. And I think that is a grossly uncharitable thing to say about a man as wonderful as Hans Urs von Balthasar was. And the point that he moved in with von Speyer and her husband is a sort of case in point. He moved in with her towards when she was already sort of old and almost an invalid. And her husband was very, very sort of sick and so on. And it just was hard for her to travel and so on. So Balthasar moved in with her to, in a sense, be her spiritual director. And it didn't stop him from doing his other duties. He just sort of happened to live there. But there was nothing untoward. There was nothing weird about the relationship. And some people have taken Ralph Martin's book as a reason to cast aspersions on their relationship as somehow immoral and so on. And simply, Adrian von Speyer is not everybody's cup of tea. She's not my favorite author or person either. But nevertheless, Balthasar, who knew her very, very well, thought that her charisms, her supernatural experiences were legitimate. And by the way, she didn't want anybody to know about them until after she died. She didn't profit from any of it. She didn't broadcast it at all, that she was having these mystical experiences. She was a doctor who opened her doors to the poor. She was, by all accounts, a deeply wonderful mother to her children, and very charitable towards the poor. And so, by all accounts, she was a woman of deep virtue, even holiness, who did not evince in her life any great, bizarre, strange, esoteric weirdness, right? And so I think Ralph Martin is unfair. Now, like I said, if you don't like Adrian, you don't like Adrian, but I think Ralph Martin makes way too much of that relationship.
Right, probably that's a separate theme, because he wrote a very serious and solid article based on the writings on Hans Urs von Balthasar, but probably we need to elaborate that separately. Last question before I pass floor to Zbigniew. We are running out of time, but this is also important for my son, who asked me this question in the context of Bishop Barron discussion with Orthodox Jew, whom you know this program, and he asked me how to pass the faith, how to talk about the faith to believing Orthodox Jews, to fulfill the mission of the Church of the Christ, that we should pronounce gospel, we should call for repentance. This brings me to my mind. There is a Roy Schumann, converted Jew into Catholicism, and he said that Catholics are sometimes too timid to talk to Jews, because there is especially in US, this kind of barrier that we might be perceived as proselytes. So any comment? I know this is delicate area, but shall we deprive our Jewish brothers from gospel, from good news, because they are Jews and they've got separate privilege, they've got separate way to salvation? What's your thoughts on that?
Well, my thoughts is, of course, we should evangelize our Jewish brothers and sisters. And Bishop Barron did evangelize Ben Shapiro. He just didn't do it in a way that pleases everybody. A lot of traditionalists who are critical of that interview apparently wanted Barron to simply, come in with a bunch of tanks and start shooting off, all these apologetical arguments as to why Ben Shapiro should become a Catholic. But, that can also be a very counterproductive way of approaching evangelization. There's more than one way to evangelize someone, and one way is to simply engage in intellectual conversation, to establish a foundation of friendship and dialogue and conversation on an intellectual level, that then invites the speaker into your interlocutor into your intellectual worldview, and that's in a sense what Barron was doing. But it is certainly not true that he didn't evangelize Ben Shapiro. If people tend to focus on the first part of that interview, where Shapiro says to Barron, as a Jew, am I just screwed? Which is an English word that means, am I really out of luck here? Am I going to go to hell? And Barron rightly simply quotes the Second Vatican Council and the teaching of the Church, that yes, people outside of the visible confines of the Church can be saved. But then he went on to immediately say that all the grace of salvation comes through Christ. He in no way became a religious relativist at this point. It's all grace comes through Christ, but it might come to non-Catholics in their moral conscience and in other ways. And so he said, no, you're not necessarily screwed. But then he went on, and most people don't get to the full hour-long interview towards the tail end of the interview, where he starts talking to Ben Shapiro about how Christ represents the fulfillment of Judaism. Christ represents, he fulfills temple, he fulfills monarchy, he fulfills prophecy, he fulfills the law. All right. And he showed how theologically Christ is the fulfillment of Judaism. So what he was attempting to do there with Ben Shapiro is to invite him into a deeper conversation about Jesus as the fulfillment of Judaism. We need to understand, and Barron knew this, because I know Barron, all right? Barron knew this. Ben Shapiro doesn't even think Jesus was a Jewish prophet. He has a very low opinion of Jesus. Ben Shapiro thinks that Jesus was a political revolutionary who led an insurrection against Rome and got himself killed, like other so-called Jewish warrior messiahs of that time, like Bar Kokhba and others. Okay, that is Ben Shapiro's historical view of the historical Jesus. Now, if knowing that your Jewish dialogue partner thinks that about Jesus, the first thing you need to do is to kind of disabuse him of that misconception. Although, I mean, he's not going to accept Christ just because you offer an altar call. Hey, come to Jesus, because he has this very negative view of Jesus. You have to begin by laying out the theological reasons why it is that Jesus actually fulfills Judaism, that he was not simply a political insurrectionist against Rome, and what his true mission from the Father was. And that's what Barron did. Now, was he perfect? Could he have done otherwise? Yeah, sure. But I think so much of the criticism directed him at this is just, I think it's a way of traditionalists trying to bring Barron down because they don't like his vision of the church. Period.
Yeah, one thing that I would say to that interview is that the evangelization and the explanation of the fulfillment of the Jewish faith by Jesus is all good and well, but there is a dot missing at the end. That's
Okay.
When Shapiro says, "Am I okay if I remain Jewish?" Then Bishop Barron doesn't say, "You might be in a lot of trouble." If I'm right, and I believe I am, okay. So the only thing that I am thinking is that's probably the timidity that Peter referred to before.
Yeah.
That we are nice to the people of other faiths to the point of even sometimes taking their viewpoint. And why are we nice? Because there's a history of persecution of the Jews.
Yes.
But then that persecution, the first victims were Jesus himself, then St. Stephen, and we know what St. Paul did, but then we know what St. Paul suffered. Okay, and that persecution was first the other way around. And I think that from a standpoint of religion, we don't have anything to apologize for, yeah? From a standpoint of nations, of states, yeah, all right. But not from that standpoint. So that's the only sort of reservation I have to that interview.
Well, yeah, I think that's perhaps a valid criticism. Bishop Barron's methodology is Irenic. I wouldn't call it timid. It's so much his if you watch all of his interviews with everyone that he interviews, it really is an attempt at Irenic dialogue, peaceful dialogue, non-combative dialogue. And that carries with it certain risks, a certain downside, that it can come across as looking timid, and not as robust as it should be. So perhaps Bishop Barron at the end should have said, yeah, you might be in a bit of trouble if you don't, investigate the Jesus is the fulfillment of Judaism a little bit more. So yeah, okay. I'm not here to be a Bishop Barron apologist. He's a big boy. He can defend himself, and he has. I just think that overall, I despite what criticisms you can make here and there of the interview, I thought overall the interview was wonderful.
Yeah.
And I think the criticisms that are brought to bear from hyper traditionalists against him are given in bad faith. I just don't think that their chief concern is with Ben Shapiro's soul. I think it's more ideological.
Yeah, and you bear in mind that you are talking to fans of Bishop Barron, so
Yeah, well, yeah,
we're not attacking them for.
Yeah, and full disclosure, I've known Barron for years. I know him to be a wonderful, wonderful man, a brilliant theologian, a great priest, and a good friend. And so, full disclosure, I do have an interest in defending his good name.
Yeah, okay. Yeah, the last topic that we wanted to cover with you today is whether, as Christians and Catholics in the United States and in other Western countries, we should prepare for persecution, for martyrdom in our lifetime, as Dr. Thomas Williams wrote in his book that is going to be published soon. We see what's happening with the political world, and the United States is exerting a huge influence on other countries, and these things will be copied in other countries. We see assaults, killings of Christians, like the school where 3 children and 3 teachers were murdered by a person hostile to Christianity. Most likely, we see FBI arresting people for praying. So should we prepare for that, and how should we handle this? How should we look at it?
Yeah, we do have to prepare for this. I mean, there was also the case, I believe it was in the United Kingdom, of a woman who's been arrested a couple of times for simply standing across the street from an abortion clinic silently. She was praying silently. She was not offering anything vocally, and she was still arrested for praying outside of an abortion clinic. So that is the kind of martyrdom. I mean, there was a case here in the United States of a man named Mark Houck, who lived near me here in Pennsylvania, who was outside of an abortion clinic praying, and he got into an altercation with an abortion clinic worker who came out and was berating his son and provoking an argument. The FBI, with a SWAT team with assault rifles, came to this man's home in the middle of the night and banged on his door and arrested him in front of his children because he violated some Access to Abortion Clinic Act or something. He was exonerated in court by a jury within 3 hours of the case going to the jury. But this represents, and it just recently came out too, that the FBI in the United States, Federal Bureau of Investigation, has targeted Catholic churches for secret infiltration, to seek out possible terrorism and so on. So yeah, this is a very real threat as governments become ever more unchristian and then anti-Christian. The mask of neutrality is going to come down very, very, very quickly. I just have a new book out by Ignatius Press called Confession of a Catholic Worker. And this forms basically the overarching theme of the book, that following Hans Urs von Balthasar, the fact is the modern world, its internal metaphysical and spiritual logic is going to become increasingly aligned with the sort of what we would call an antichrist spirit. And for us to remain faithful, You're not simply going to be able to remain sort of neutral in the face of that. The government is going to force a choice upon you. And so the sort of theme of my book is choice. We must now choose for or against Christ, or we won't be Christians at all. Now, how do we prepare ourselves to make this choice for Christ in the face of ongoing, mostly white martyrdom, not red martyrdom of blood, but mostly the white martyrdom of a kind of persecution, legal persecution? How do we prepare ourselves for that? I have no answer for that beyond simply we have to in the United States, we circle the wagons, which is a way of saying, develop communities, strong faith-based communities. There's an American author named Rod Dreher, Eastern Orthodox, used to be Catholic, wrote a famous book called The Benedict Option. And that's a very famous book now. I don't know if it's been translated into Polish.
Yeah, it has been.
And this is his essential point, that just as Saint Benedict preserved civilization after the fall of the Roman Empire by creating these monastic enclaves of culture and learning as well as religion, we have to be about the business of creating enclaves of civilization, not just proper catechesis. We have to be enclaves of sanity and civilization and learning and culture. We have to become, once again, advocates for all things true, good, and beautiful. And we have to do so by banding together in whatever ways that we can. Like I said, we do it here in my parish near us, which is a very, very faithful Catholic parish. It's actually a parish that we call an ordinary, an Anglican ordinariate parish. Pope Benedict allowed Anglicans to come into the Catholic Church and to bring their Anglican liturgy with them. And we attend that church because we love the liturgy so much. But it's also a deeply faith-based community. And I hold it up as a model for what we need to do going forward. We have to be strong communities of faith where we band together, pool our resources, educate our children, and face the challenges that are, and we have to be willing to suffer. We're going to suffer.
And the last question or request, would you be so kind and have a few words of a message to our Polish audience from yourself, your reflection of what we should think, what we should do, what you think, what your spirit, what the Holy Spirit tells you?
What the Holy Spirit tells me is that what I want the Polish people to know is how inspiring to millions of American Catholics Poland was, with solidarity, Lech Walesa, Pope John Paul, and the Polish Catholicism. I'm not certain perhaps Polish people understand the extent to which Catholics around the world looked to them with great admiration and great hope, that here is what can be done in a nation that has remained powerfully Catholic, and not in name only, but deeply culturally so. And so what I would beg Polish Catholics to remember that legacy that you gave to the world, and to not let it go. That Poland remains, I think, a very important piece of the Catholic Church's future in the world, and to please defend the legacy of Pope John Paul.
Amen.
Thank you very much. Amen.
Thank you. That's very important. Today is the anniversary of the baptism of Poland. 1057 years ago was baptism of 1996. 966.
996. 966.
So
966.
Today,
yes.
This is the feast. I put the flag on my house, white, red flag, just to commemorate that. So your words are very important for us. Thank you very much, Larry, and we really enjoyed the conversation, which was open, frank, and friendly. Thank you very much.
Thank you guys for having me. Thank you so much.